after this. And so recording is now in progress. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Miley. I am affirmed by they, them pronouns, and I am NQAPIA's programs manager. I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with Sherrie to put this training on for you. And for those of you that are just tapping in and aren't familiar with NQAPIA, the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance is the only national LGBTQ plus AANHPI nonprofit. And so we work with a lot of grassroots organizations and do a lot of capacity building work to really support the work that you are all doing on the ground in different localities and across the country. So the purpose of this training is to really start kind of grounding ourselves in certain like grant writing skills, navigating the process. But really the intention of this entire workshop series is to equip our grassroots folks on the ground with some tools and skills and language to navigate the development space. We all know the federal landscape is a mess right now in more ways than one, and that certainly affects our funding and how we sustain all of the great work that we're doing. And so this is really sort of heavily informed by actually a lot of people that we are in community with. So shout out to all of the fiscal sponsees, mini grantees, community members that have shaped what this training series looks like, because it's heavily been informed by what our people need. And so we really, really appreciate any sort of feedback in terms of like what it is that you're looking to learn, what skills you are missing and need to continue doing the work and sustaining all of this movement that we have happening across different spaces and communities. And so with that, I am going to pass it over to Sherrie to introduce himself, and we'll start sharing my screen shortly.
Hi everyone, I'm Sherrie. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a co-director of movement building at Emergent Fund. Um, I am relatively newer to philanthropy, so I think I bring a different type of experience. I have written many grants, particularly for organizations that are engaging in direct action or movement building or potentially activities that are not likely to be funded. And so hopefully that is helpful in this space. I also am a parent, so you may see a child or hear a child or a dog at any time during this call. And if you have any of those in your home as well, I welcome them to join us. Um, yeah, and that's a little bit about me. I do have some just like tech stuff. So if you haven't yet changed your name and your pronouns in your little name box, if you could do that, that would be super helpful for me and for others. And if you do want to utilize closed captioning, please feel free to um, hit the show captions button at the bottom. And Miley, if you are sharing your screen, it just looks like a black loading sign, the thing. We're having technical difficulties today.
Uh-oh, let's give this another whirl. Okay, let's try this again.
It's okay. Well, you're
Thank you,
trying.
everyone.
Yeah, it's okay. I don't trust Zoom. Okay. And while, yeah, so if you're able to do that, that's great. And then um, if you want to skip a couple more slides, great. Um, if folks could share in the chat your name, your pronouns, or affiliation, and where you're joining from, and what you're reading right now in the chat box. There's so many of you without faces. All right, I'm gonna trust that you are writing things in the chat box. Cool, and we'll move on to the agenda for what we are going to talk about today. Um, so during our time together, we're going to discuss grant writing, but a very, very intro version. We have about maybe 45 minutes to 50 minutes together with some spaciousness for Q&A. Um, I am hoping that I get through all of these things with you all, but if you have questions at any time, feel free to drop them in the chat and or hold on to them till the end. Um, I imagine this time will go by pretty quickly. There are lots of folks who have registered for this workshop who have varying skills of grant writing experience. And so also would love to encourage people to share what you know as I am bringing topics into this space in the chat box with each other. I am by no means an expert, but I do have lots of my own personal experience, and I bet many of you do too. And so if we could create some sort of collective sharing, that would be amazing. Um, we're gonna talk a little bit about grant writing kind of in the way in which I approach it. So getting organized, getting all of my things together, thinking about how I'm centering my relationships and compiling different types of data, thinking through the grant requirements, thinking about how I'm going to tell the story of my organization from the perspective of someone who might be benefiting from the work that I'm doing, or from the perspective as someone who's working from a development perspective. And just in this political moment, some security culture practices we might want to consider when we're writing our grants, and just some things I've been noticing as I've been reviewing grants. So Emergent Fund is a rapid response funder. We provide about 30 grants a month to different organizations. And there's some things that I'm noticing in how people have been writing that I personally am very supportive of, but also am seeing maybe get flagged by compliance. And just want to note some of those things for folks if you're getting ready to write some grants in this moment. So, yeah, step one, getting organized. Could you please go to the next? I feel weird telling you what to do. Okay, thank you. So number one, just be really clear about your goal, like your grant writing goal, not our overarching goal as an organization, but is my goal in writing this grant to raise money for a specific project or a specific campaign? Is this for general operations? You might be doing all of these things, and that's okay, but being really clear when you are approaching each grant as if its own project in and of itself, because not all grants will support all of these different things. It is not many funders provide general operating grants, which is often why many organizations are struggling in this current moment, especially organizations who are losing federal funding. Um, and the clearer you are when you're approaching the grant, the more likely your story is going to get across. If you are kind of muddling your narrative between like, I'm fundraising for this specific project, but also general operations, it can be confusing for the person who is reading your grant on the other end. The other thing you're going to do is gather all existing materials, and I have a slide about it a little later, but um, anything that exists about your organization that has been written by whether it's you, the person who is writing the grant, or even other folks on your team, if they have any position papers, project proposals, whatever your social media person might be posting, just the ways in which people are communicating about your work, or maybe you are cross-posted from a fellow organization that is posting about your org. Like, how are people talking about your work really will support you in building out whatever it is that you're going to be writing about. So try to collect all of those things. The next thing you're going to do is research. You're going to identify all these grant opportunities. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And we're also going to lean really heavily into our relationships, whether it's your funder relationships or your relationships with community members or organizational membership. But also in this moment, it's really important to be mindful of the different power dynamics. Funders themselves, we need to be really mindful of our power dynamic, and if they are a trust-based philanthropist, they should be introducing you as a grantee to other funders, because it is our job to build relationships with other foundations so that we can do that. Um, Ideally, that's what they should be doing. Not all funders do that. I just want to name that. Um, the other thing to note is like you also might be sitting in a position of a power dynamic. You know, if you are an organization that provides services and you're hoping to get a statement from a community member about the benefits of your organization, you know, they might feel like they might not be able to receive those services if they don't offer a testimony. And so just thinking about how we might approach those relationships is really important, and we have to be very intentional in how we move. Cool. Can I have the next slide, please? All right, so we're gonna gather our existing materials. So this could be a toolkit that your social media digital organizer comms person made. It could be a project proposal that a staff member wrote about their specific project. It could be images that you hopefully have consent to use. This could also be any type of press releases. And I am going to, oh, you can share that. I'm going to share this document with y'all in the resources, just like it's just a template that y'all can have as a resource for you to start collecting all of this information. And there's a couple of reasons why I think it's really important for you to work collaboratively, particularly with other staff or volunteers in your organization. Um, Especially if sometimes you're very siloed from the work that's going on the ground, but I don't think that that's probably the case for many of you. But in some organizations, the development people are not very much engaged in the work that's happening. Um, if we're not actually talking about the work correctly in the grants that we are writing, we might be writing a restricted grant, which means like we have less flexibility and we are committing the people in our organization to do work that maybe they were not planning on doing just because we need to access the funding. And so actually truly understanding like what is the goal of the projects that our team members are hoping to implement in the upcoming year or in their programming is actually being well represented in what we're writing about. The worst thing we could do is just keep trying to write grants for the sake of having access to money, but then having to create programs to meet the requirements of those grants, and then we're losing our staff or volunteer capacity. So just something to consider. And another thing we're going to do is research. And I saw this a lot in a lot of folks' applications or registration forms to this training was, where do I find the grants? And the reality is you just kind of have to be nosy. I'm gonna be honest. Um, so many of us have our own organizations, and we are oftentimes compared to other orgs, or we might be in coalition with other organizations. We might feel like we are in, hopefully friendly competition with other organizations. And I would encourage you to look on their websites, see if they publicly list their funding partners, or they might just have them listed as partners on their websites. Um, Another thing you can do is check out if they have board members of their organizations. Usually board members are also associated with other organizations. Many organizations have people in philanthropy on their boards. And so if they are in philanthropy and on board of an org that is similar to yours, hopefully they would be interested in an org like yours as well. Um, and so that is a way to get the names of some places you could potentially seek out grants. Another thing you could do if you haven't is join a national member coalition. And so there's various, I mean, NQAPIA is one. uh, but there are other organizations that are, specific to environmental justice organizing, or worker solidarity organizing. And a lot of times these coalitions have their own member-only based grants that you could apply for, whether it's to attend their events, their capacity building events, trainings, conferences, or to support your own work. And that is another way of accessing grants. Another thing is even being more of a researcher and going on to websites like Candid or ProPublica to like look up organizations 990s. And so nonprofits often should fill out a 990 at the end of the year for their taxes, and they do list the places in which they've received funding. And so if there's an organization that might be similar to yours, you might be able to find it. So some of these websites require you to have a membership, but you can often access a lot of this information for free if you look around. And you also sometimes can just Google this stuff and find people's 990s, which is also slightly scary, I will be honest, but it is there. So use it in a positive way to access the information for yourself. Um, cool. Can you go to the next slide, please? When you're doing this research, you're going to come across different names of organizations, and it's really helpful to know the difference between the different types of places that might be distributing these funds. So there are foundations, and there's many, many kinds. There's a couple more that I didn't even list here, but um, the foundations are supposed to be giving away at least 5% um, of their funds. So just thinking through if you are reaching out to a bigger foundation, knowing that they, I think in my mind, I'm like, you have money that does not belong to you. So please give it away. And being comfortable working through that is very challenging, asking for funds, but just knowing that they exist with a specific reason, and that is oftentimes a charitable reason. um, I will say, like, if you are building relationships with grant officers or program officers at potentially like a family foundation, just know that someone shared with me recently that essentially, if you are a program officer at a family foundation, it is like being at a family's like dining room table where they are talking about politics constantly and trying to decide what is a priority for their family in this moment. Um, and so I think building a genuine relationship, especially if you're working with folks in a family foundation, can be really helpful in understanding those priorities without you having to navigate um, the confusing wishy-washiness of a potential foundation. Just directly talking to the program officer and asking, like, what is your grant making priority? I see that you have a general interest of health equity, but what does that actually mean? So you don't get pulled in many different directions. Um, yes, the slides will be shared afterwards for sure. And I will also be sharing a resource folder as well, because I also know that I talk fast because I'm from the Northeast. Yes. Um, I am seeing some questions in the chat, and I'm gonna pause for a second to answer them. Um, do you give emergency support to organizations? So Emergent Fund does offer rapid response funds. There are a few rapid response funders that you could consider. So it depends on the like emergency. Um, if you're looking for, security culture grants or um, yeah, I think it just depends on how you're defining emergency. But what I can do is follow up with a couple of lists of organizations that offer rapid response funding in times of crisis afterwards. And but some I would name might be Urgent Action Fund. They have a like security grant, and Solidaire also has one as well. Um, how do you reach out to family foundations? I found them to be particularly cagey. That is correct. Yes. Um, yes. They are definitely going to be cagey. So the best way that I have found reaching out to these foundations, family foundations, to be honest, is if I have been able to attend conferences or offer workshops at conferences where I know that folks in philanthropy might be there. That has been the easiest way for me to access people directly. Um, if I'm not able to attend those spaces, it has been by connecting with one of my other program officers from a grant that I might receive and ask them directly, are there any other foundations that might be able to support us for XYZ, but being very clear of what it is that we are looking for. So today I met with a grantee who applied to our grants for a very specific project. And I asked, like, are there other things that you were seeking funding for? Um, and was very clear, like, it may not be something that we fund. And so not all grant our program officers are going to ask you that directly, but I just like want to encourage you honestly to feel um, that you can be clear, like, we also are seeking funding for this, and I know that may not be in your wheelhouse, but could you please let me know of any other funder that might be interested in funding something like that? Um, and let me see, not having too much extensive experience with grant sourcing, but wanted to know about 990's ethics around sourcing funding from angel investors, investors that aren't values aligned. Doesn't matter where the money is sourced from. Yeah, so I can't answer that question. So this is mostly about, I would say, understanding what your organization's values are when it comes to accepting funds. Um, I've worked at organizations that have received funding from companies, like I would say, this especially around corporate giving, that I don't personally align with and have asked to not receive that type of funding before. And so I think within your own organization, strategizing around what it is that you feel comfortable receiving and not receiving. Um, Not all 990s for sure are made public. And I think a thing about money is it is very likely that it came from a place that we are not all values aligned with. It is very likely to have been stolen, um, is very likely to have been like definitely curated from places that we yeah, don't definitely do not align with. And so I think it is also okay to ask the funder directly, where did these funds come from? And I think that also kind of aligns with like family donors. Like there are big organizations, like big family donors, that maybe you don't necessarily, like the Bezos Foundation, you may not align with Jeff Bezos. And so just thinking that you may not want to receive funds from them. Um, doo-doo-doo. There are some big conferences coming up. Okay, I'm gonna answer this last question and then we'll move on. Sorry, these are great questions. Um, there are some big found conferences that are coming up, and there's two things I want to say about these events. If you have a funder who is going to attend these events, um, ask them to pay for you to go, because they should be. So there is the Unity Summit that is coming up in Minneapolis at the end of October. And then there is Creating Change Conference that happens at the start of next year. And I think those are really great places for grantees to connect with their funders. Um, if a funder is not able to provide your registration fee, I think also just reaching out to the folks who are organizing those events to ask what support do they have for organizers to attend, because often they can attend at a lower cost. Cool. All right. Um, I think one thing I want to uplift as an intermediary funder, I would like to uplift them. I think they are often the ones who connect big philanthropy to grass tops or grassroots organizations and are often more movement aligned. And we do try to move quicker. Um, Do we all do that? No, but I will say that that is a characteristic of many of us. And then also don't be shy from asking community for support and resources. And I think many of us already do this through crowdfunding. We might use like different platforms. Additionally, individual donors or um, giving circles, and also really leaning into alternative economies. Cool. Could you? Okay. And I talked a little bit, not extensively, but around like unrestricted or restricted grants. And so unrestricted grants are great because they are pretty flexible. Many people use them for general operations, staff salaries, things that might come up, and they often don't have many requirements. But the caveat with that is they can be difficult to access. And then restricted grants are often project-based or very specific, like topic-based grants, or they're very clear that you can only use them for specific things. They're not flexible. You cannot all of a sudden um, decide that you want to use it for something else. I think a sort of sweet example of this was I worked at an organization, and when someone passed away, they left a significant amount of funds, like thousands of dollars, that could only be used to purchase ice cream cakes for the children who lived in shelter. And we could not use it for anything else. It could only be used for ice cream cakes on their birthday. Um, and sometimes they are sweet and sometimes challenging because I was like, I would really love to use that to buy people shoes or something else. But that was very specific to this particular donor, what she wanted us to use the funds for. Um, I'm not saying that unrestricted grants won't require reports, but oftentimes with restricted grants, there is this pressure for measurable outcomes. There's not a lot of flexibility there. They do want to know that the funds are being used in the way that they asked, and they want to know that you have succeeded in some way. And I would really encourage folks that when you are writing your project narrative, to really be expansive in what a win is for you. Um, I think you could be really quantitative in your win, but I think as the world is constantly changing, I think it's okay for us to redefine what wins are for our own communities. Um, yeah. Could I have the next slide, please? Great. I'm going to talk a little bit about centering your relationships, specifically. Uh, well, could you go to the next slide? Thanks. Specifically with community, your staff or volunteers, and with funders. I think one thing I would really encourage folks to do is consider applying with other organizations as a way of accessing funds, um, applying as a coalition, um, and working collaboratively with membership to get their consent to share their stories, and I mean membership as in like your community members, whether they're organizational members. Um, yeah, so really reach out to those folks and connect with them and see if you have their consent to share their stories. Again, working collaboratively with your staff or volunteers, not just to be like, can I have your project proposal so I know how you're talking about this work, but really talk to them about their experiences, communicating with other folks. I think that's really, really crucial. And understanding how your staff actually feel about the work that they're doing. Because if you start to notice that your staff are feeling too pressured, it might be because we're fundraising for things that they're not interested in doing. And because we got so many, restricted grants, they're having to do those things. And so really figuring out how they actually feel about the work that they're doing in this moment. Um, and also understanding their priorities, and we want to have shared language. Um, And then when it comes to your funders, like I said, please do ask them for recommendations. I'm pretty honest with my grantees that if there are people that I can recommend them to, I will. And the other thing is many of us sit on tables. And by sitting on tables, I mean we're on a lot of Zoom calls staring at other funders. And it is our responsibility to bring your names into those spaces and uplift the work that you're doing. And so if you are looking to build a relationship with funders, try to schedule one-on-ones with them and talk about the work that you're doing, and also know what you can and can't, like you can ask for or not ask for. Um, I think about this with Reggie. I don't know if it's okay if I share this story, but um, the first time I met Reggie, they were just like, oh yeah, NQAPIA doesn't fit within your grant making guidelines, but our fiscal sponsees might, and so I think that is how we should be moving with each other. Being really aware that um, specifically this funder myself and Capia doesn't fit within our guidelines, but Reggie was bringing in all of these other folks into the room with them. And so that's how funders should be moving and or other organizers could be moving. And so as you're building relationships with funders, don't think that this is your only chance. Who are the other folks or other organizations within your community that you can also bring into the room when you're talking to funders? Um, because the reality is it's it we could fund one organization in one city that's just doing amazing work, but if we were able to fund more organizations in that collective space, the uptick in capacity means that you're able to take on more things as a collective, and hopefully we can win and defeat our oppressors. That's that's how we're gonna do it. Okay. Oh, and sorry, the last thing I want to say is like philanthropy. I have never used the word movement more than when I joined philanthropy last year, and I don't know what they're talking about. Like, I'm like, you do know there's more than one movement. Which movement? But they always say the movement, like as if there is one. And so I just want to name that, like, folks in philanthropy use language in a way that is so confusing to me. Um, so that if you are writing your grants, when you're using words like mutual aid or organizing, they have their own definitions of what these things mean. So feel free to explain to them what you actually mean and be very clear, like my community needs this type of organizing because of XYZ. Not just name the tactic that you are using or the strategy that you're using so broadly. It's okay for you to be more pointed as to why you're doing it that way and how you as your organization is defining that work. So yeah, I just wanted to name that. And yeah, philanthropy is a wild place, and I am still trying to figure out who the overarching movement is. Um, and maybe we'll figure it out together. Okay, cool. So grant requirements. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. There are lots of grant requirements for many organizations. I and Emergent Fund have specifically been trying really hard to get rid of applications. That is my goal. We have gotten to a point where we have a pre-screen with lots of logistical questions where you just check off boxes and then maybe one question where you have to write 2 sentences. Because I would like folks to be organizing in the field and not necessarily filling out documents. But I can't ignore the fact that many other folks have grant requirements. And oftentimes, these are some of them. So when folks are asking for your organization mission and priorities, this is really the foundation of what we're going to understand what your organization is about. And we're going to compare everything else that you write about in your grant to your priorities. So if your priorities are flexible, please let us know that they're flexible. But if you say like we specifically only do XYZ, but then for some reason in your narrative, you're telling me LMNOP, I might not understand why you're doing that. And I might question your capacity to do this type of work if it's nothing you've ever done before. And so that's something to just consider. Um, when you're talking about your narrative, there's like a piece around, it might be your proposal, it might be your project narrative. We're going to try to see if it aligns with your organizational priorities. Something I am noticing, especially in this political moment, is some folks maybe are using C4 language to describe their C3 work. And if we know that you do not have a C4 status, meaning like you might be talking about um, C3s can do like voter registration. They can encourage people to engage in local elections, but they can't say like, please vote for this specific person. And we are seeing a lot of C3 folks applying for grants saying like, we want to support this particular individual in their upcoming election. Um, and so if we're seeing that work, that's great. I'm glad you're doing that work. And also it may not align with your nonprofit status, and that would be a flag for us. So just being really mindful of the language that you might be using to describe your work. Um, I'm gonna wonder like what are the conditions that exist that you are now responding in this particular way, why you're doing it, and why your organization is the one to do this work. Um, I think there were a couple questions about budgeting when grant requirements ask about your budget. It really depends on what you're applying for and what the grant is offering. But oftentimes we'll ask for something specific around like your operating budget. What is your operating budget? And sometimes we just want to know the number. But when you're applying for a specific project, we might want to know the itemized breakdown of that project. Um, and I also encourage you to be name flexibility within that. Um, and then in terms of reporting, there are grants that don't require reporting. Emergent Fund does not require any C3 reporting on our grants. So would encourage folks to seek that out. Um, but be really honest about your capacity to provide the type of reports that the organization or the funder is requesting, and ask them if they offer any support to make sure that you are able to report in the ways that they would like you to. Especially if you are a grassroots organization, they can't expect you to have a whole data department. That's not fair. And so feel comfortable asking, like, do you offer any support on providing that type of reporting? Can I have the next slide, please? We're not going to take a break because Miley told me I had a warning. But I do encourage folks to take breaks if they need them because this is being recorded and we will send you the slides later. Okay, so step 3 is just storytelling. This is a place where you can share quantitative and qualitative data, and a lot of times folks are able to collect stories from those who are benefiting from your organizational services or your organizational works. It is really helpful if you back that up with quantitative data. So say someone says like, I really benefited from this organization because they were able to support us achieve these things. And then you're able to say, not only were we able to help this one individual, but we were able to support this many and actually give the quantity of that many people. Being really clear who you're offering support to and who like we want to know who your people are, and we want to know what they have to say about your work. And we really want to know what it is that you're trying to address and why you are addressing it the way you are, because that will differentiate you from other organizations. Emergent Fund used to have this question on our application that was like, what is the like political moment you're responding to? And people would be like, white supremacy. Like, yeah. That's we all are, it wasn't a great question on our part. And also it didn't really create the spaciousness for people to tell us what it is that they were actually responding to. And we got many applications that were the same. We couldn't tell them apart. And we really want to know what your strategy, what about your strategy is unique compared to others. Cool. Can you go to the next slide, please? And Chinyere, I see your question. I'll come back to it. In the interest of time, we're not going to do this activity, but I would encourage folks to write these questions down. These are 2 questions that we do ask folks or think about when we are devising a lot of our grant requirements in terms of our questioning. So if you were able to reach your goals, if you were able to achieve what you set out to achieve, how will your community's future be improved? Like, what will change? If you exist and are able to do what you set out to do, what will change? And then when we are meeting with people one-on-one, we really want to know why you are so personally invested. Like, why are you so committed to this work? That you are willing to have one-on-ones with us, that you are willing to talk about this work, that you're willing to learn everything you can about the work that you're doing. And I encourage you to ask us why we are invested in funding organizations like yours. Okay. If you don't have an org operating budget, would grant writing be focused instead on proposed project budget breakdowns? Yes, and I would indicate that you don't have an operating budget. And then some examples of strategies to answer the question of priorities and why. I think an example of responding to priorities and why. So I used to run a direct action organization that started off as an environmental org. And when we transitioned to starting to fight prisons and ICE, we really needed to build a narrative around why these 2 things are connected. And so a part of that is like the narrative piece about why these 2 things were so important to us was we needed to just talk about our identities. And so being able to talk about ourselves as individuals who maybe come from mixed status homes, whose families are migrating because of climate change and also are being torn apart by ICE, that was an example of explaining like why these 2 issues were a priority to us. It was deeply rooted to our identity and how we were going to organize in this moment. Okay, I'm going to come back to these other questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, quickly around security culture practices. I'll go quick. Don't mention any illegal activities. I don't want to know that you're going to lock your body to anything. Please don't tell me. Please don't tell me that you need to raise bail funds for something. If you choose to use the grant for bail funds, that's great. But don't tell us. Making sure again that you have consent to use people's images, their stories, anything. And it's okay for you to ask your funders security culture practices, like where might this information be stored? What is your data retention policy? When will this be deleted? It's okay to also request encrypted communications. Can we talk on Signal or Jitsi, or is there another way to check in about something that's not on Zoom or general Gmail? Try to share more about your strategy and not just your tactic. So your overarching plan and not specifically always how you're trying to do something if it might allude to something illegal. And also sometimes it's okay to leave your funder on a need to know basis. It's a lot of things about philanthropy, like funders really have this like air of wanting you to prove that they can trust you. It's okay for you to expect them to do something to make you trust them. Especially in this moment around your safety and security. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Submissions and follow-up. There are so many platforms that many of us are using. A lot of folks use Just Fund, which has a common application, which helps you search for other funders that you could potentially apply to. And some of them just require you to use that common app and answer a couple of other questions. So if you're not on that platform, try using that platform. But once you submit your grant and say you were accepted, it's okay to schedule a one-on-one and figure out why. Like, what about your grant application people were interested in? What about your work they were interested in? Because that could help inform what you write about in the future. If you were not accepted, it's also okay to follow up and ask for a one-on-one about why you were not of interest in this moment for this particular funder. Um, and sometimes they're not able to meet with you, but ideally they would answer and let you know what's going on. And that's what I'll say quickly, just because I want to create space for all of your questions that you're asking. Um, what do you find from your position is a question that folks looking for funding do not ask? Or could you speak on the syntax and vocabulary used when applying for funding? How plain can the language be when it comes to communication? I will say this depends on the funder. Um, Especially a social justice aligned funder is not going to check your grammar. They're not going to check if you spelled something correctly, especially if we're requesting your grant in English and we don't offer any other opportunities for you to apply in a different language. Um, we're not going to check any of those things. Um, there are some funders who maybe have really extensive requirements that they will pay attention really deeply to how you are writing about your work, and the language that you're using to describe it. So it really just depends on also, I think, like Chineri was saying, like finding values aligned funders at the same time. Um, I think another thing to know, I don't know if Ben and Jerry still does this as a funder, but I remember one time we applied for a grant and like the first round was like people who read grants all the time. And so the language we used to describe our work got us through the first round. But then the second round, they actually had their staff members review the grants, and they did not like our grant because it was too academic. And so just naming that you might want to know who are the different audiences reading your grants and as they go through the process. Um, cool. I don't know if there are other questions. Sorry, I also named I was very nervous before I did this workshop, and so I'm sorry if nothing I said made sense. But if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think that nothing made sense was the case. Um, but yeah, feel free to keep dropping questions if you have them in the chat. We'll be sure to save them as well if we can't get to them. But can we just show a little bit of love for Sherrie? Feel free to drop some words of affirmation in the chat as well. Some cute little emojis. What other fun little feature signals got? I don't know.
Yeah, this is kind of creepy. Wow. Yeah.
LLL.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here to answer questions. And I also dropped my email in the chat. Um, Demetrius, I love you. And thanks for always saying I'm doing amazing. Um, I encourage folks to reach out to me. I'm always available, even if you're not applying to my grant. I'm down to support and review anything that folks have. If you have any questions, I will follow up with my Calendly link and we can chat through anything that you're working on.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sherrie. I'm going to go ahead and stop our cloud recording right now, and then we're going to just